Have you ever wondered why difficult conversations are so hard to have? You might also be wondering what this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. This illustrates the many facets of emotional intelligence and how to bridge the gap towards DEI. We are so excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be fantastic. I am looking forward to you all meeting my co host today. We value your feedback. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience as possible. This takes a great deal of effort from our part, so we are eternally grateful to all our loyal guests and listeners. Every week, we create new content and look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel to keep up with us. Hi, my name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. And for a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Today is my co-host, Dr. Rudell, and I'm going to have him introduce himself today in his own unique way. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. A pleasure as always. So my name is Enan Rudell. I am an organizational psychologist by trade, and I've spent a number of years studying and researching the factors that impact human condition. And along with that, I've spent quite a bit of time, Rachel, similar to yourself, in the space of emotional intelligence. So very, very much looking forward to our conversation today. I will add that much of today's conversation, from my perspective, will be rooted in my time as a psychotherapist. So I spent a number of years as a psychotherapist working with individuals, couples, and teams. And so I'll be looking to tap into that today as we enter into the space of difficult conversation.
So let's dive in. I think it's really difficult sometimes to enter difficult conversations. And, I want to be able to ask you this. And why do you think, or what are the benefits of leaders entering into difficult conversations?
So when leaders are willing to engage in the process of creating spaces for difficult conversations, it can create pathways within which their workforce can reach places of shared understanding, right? So by leading by example, leaders can essentially create these dialogic spaces where folks feel comfortable sharing their thoughts, insight, their perspective into how they are experiencing the workplace environment. Now, why that's valuable is because oftentimes it surfaces challenges, concerns, problems in the system that would not have surfaced otherwise. So leaders, in a sense, are really the social architects of their immediate environment and can serve as a catalyst for a healthy workplace environment.
Do you think that allows employees and leaders also to bring in their authentic selves by having these difficult conversations? I know difficult conversations also make us feel a little vulnerable. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in that. So I think, just in speaking the vulnerability for a second, I mean, I think it's impossible to talk difficult conversations without acknowledging the fact that most of us become vulnerable, right? But if we can manage that vulnerability in a way that allows us to surface our authentic selves, it creates for a richer dialogue. And again, goes right back to creating that space that I referenced a moment ago about shared understanding. And opportunities for me to better understand you and for you to better understand me.
So what does it look like then when a difficult conversation is on the horizon?
So there are factors. There's several factors actually that I would encourage leaders to look for. So in instances that are deemed high stress or high pressure or high stakes scenarios, it's typical that within the context of those situations, it's typical for folks to feel stressed, anxious, overworked, any number of symptoms. So with that said, there can often be clear signs for a need for conversations of that nature. And it again goes back to the leader's ability to be aware and in tune with the immediate workplace environment in terms of the needs of the workforce.
When you say when the leaders need to be in tuned with the workforce or the teams, what is it that you mean exactly?
Great question. So much like during my time as a therapist, when I would explore symptoms and symptomology for my patients, leaders can do the same. And so it's being in tune and aware of any sort of changes in team dynamics within the system. So if you begin to notice that folks on the team are communicating with one another less and less, particularly in instances where that wasn't the case prior to. You want to pay attention to that. That might be a sign of a number of different things. And the only way the leader is going to be able to get insight into that is by being willing to engage in that conversation around what it is that they're seeing or what it is that they're experiencing. So there can often be these clear signs in the system. And again, anytime there's a shift in workload, anytime there's substantial change around deadlines, let's say being moved up, or even a shift in priorities, from the leader perspective, I would encourage that leader to be proactive. So at the moment that those priorities shift, or the moment that the deadlines are moved up, in a sense, that presents as an opportunity for the leader to lean in and do a pulse check on their team and make sure that everyone is okay, and make sure that the leader's understanding how others are making sense of their immediate workplace environment or the objectives on the table.
I hear everything you're saying, and I think it's pretty important. It's a pretty important aspect. However, I think also there are nonverbal cues,
Mm-hmm.
and going back to what you said about leaders being attuned or in tuned with the workspace. I think there's a lot to be said for nonverbal cues. And when you mentioned that they would, if the deadlines can't be met, if there's stress or anxiety or things that, employees feel generally in a workspace, that's a nonverbal cue.
Absolutely, absolutely, and so all of what you just highlighted is important for the leader to also pay mind to. So there might be, there will often be symptoms that can be seen at face value. And I think that that's what you're speaking to in terms of like the nonverbal cues. But there also might be some other factors that deserve consideration as well. So, again, leader as social architect and as the person who's charged with the responsibility of developing workplace culture and making sure that folks can perform their role optimally, it's important to be aware and in tune with what's being said and or what's being observed. I think there's space for both.
And when we talk about space, that probably leads us to, our next point. What can leaders do to create that safe space?
hmm So, in order to create psychological safety, it's imperative for the leader to understand how the workplace environment as is being experienced by their workforce. And the only way to do that is through engaging folks in conversation, and that could be done in a number of ways, right? So most workplace environments have staff meetings, right? I think what I would suggest is, aside from these sort of structured mechanisms like a staff meeting or a weekly supervision, aside from that, making time to get to know your employees. Now, I respect that realistically, uh, it can be very challenging to establish those relationships when there's any number of objectives that need to get done, right? And I certainly understand that and wouldn't want to take away from that. But I think it costs nothing for leaders to carve out time within reason periodically to do a pulse check. And what that might look like is simply reaching out to someone and saying, hey, so how are you doing? How are you feeling about this project? How are you feeling about our department as a whole? Or how are things going for you? And creating the kind of space where they're asking the question from a meaningful perspective. So they're not asking the question to sort of bait their staff into maybe saying something that could potentially lead to some sort of formal reprimand or anything like that. They're asking the question because they care. And so again, there are a number of things leaders can do to plant that seed. And then I would even take it a step further. Once that conversation is had, showing genuine gratitude for the person that just shared whatever it is with you. And doing all that can be done within the context of their role as leaders to make sure that that information makes its way into the day-to-day in such a way where you're setting up your team for success.
Right. I agree with everything you've said, and I think also there are you're a leader yourself, in given the new digital world, and how would a leader be able to do that online if they're not right now respectively in the workspace?
Mhm.
Is there How can that be implemented or integrated into the workspace? I know it's really easy to say how are you or how are you feeling,
Yeah.
but what if there are 1,000 people in within that organization? Would you suggest to create an employee resource group, an ERG?
So first of all, I want to back up. I think that that's an amazing question, and it's so timely. And I think how I'm making sense of that is, what does leadership look like in a hybrid environment, right? And so what comes to mind for me is taking a look at sort of big picture, sort of high level perspective, right? What mechanisms are in place to foster engagement? Okay, so outside of those staff meetings, outside of supervision, are there opportunities for connection? And I'll give you an example. In one of my roles, I'm fortunate enough to be a part of a firm a consulting firm where once a week we have what they call a non-work lunch hangout. And so everyone
I
is
love that.
is asked to block an hour of their schedule, the same hour. We all commit to it every week, and people can come in and out of the room, the virtual space, right? Everyone has the link. You can click on the link, and sort of the unspoken rule is that this is not a space to talk about any project that you're on or anything work related. Literally it's literally a space to make small talk and just have conversation. And I have had some of the silliest conversations ever during that hour. But what it does is it creates connection. So
Mhm.
now I have a colleague who I'm able to work in partnership with on a project that I now know a little bit more about than I did
Mm.
prior to that. In that, was put in place by our CEO. So when we think about, again, leader as social architect, human connection means so much to this individual that they would build in this hour block for human connection.
Wow. That actually made me feel a little bit decompressed. I think there's a moment there where, right, you're in that space and you're having these conversations about your family, your friends, social life, anything that pops, jokes, and I think it allows, like you said, to build those human connections and know people at a deeper level so you can actually meet them where they are at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it increases that sense of understanding, because now I know a little more about you and what matters to you, and you know a little bit more about me, and we leave the space knowing a little bit about our respective hobbies or interests, or anything that we're involved in outside of the work environment, and it goes a long way to build the connection. And this is what I'll say. Uh, Considering the climate that we're sitting in right now, um, and the demands that we're finding uh, that are being put upon us all, right? To varying degrees and varying capacities. Um, it is imperative that we take time to understand the fragility around the human condition, and that we begin to make space and time for one's whole self. Gone are the days where we're confined to our job title, right? Our job title, or whatever sort of task we're performing at that moment. We are all so much more than that. And so I think anything that can be done to surface, um, one's whole self, I think is a good thing, and I think is beneficial when we consider long-term health of workplace environment.
Right. There's a few things I want to touch up on, but I want to welcome a LinkedIn user who, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. And they said that psychological safety is important because it fosters an environment where employees are not retaliated against or punished for speaking up with concerns, ideas, or owning up to mistakes.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And I don't think we could speak enough about the importance of psychological safety. I think I think everything that we're talking about now begins and ends with psych safety. If I don't feel psychologically safe, I'm not going to bring my whole self into the environment. I'm going to be guarded. I'm going to perform my task to the best of my ability under those circumstances. Um, but I'm probably not going to tap into um, the parts of me that enable me to surface my full strength. Simply stated, we need to feel safe psychologically.
Right. And to be able to perform at your peak. I think once
Yes.
we all feel psychologically safe,
Mhm.
where, again, like he says, you're not retaliating against or punished for speaking up about concerns, ideas, or owning up to mistakes, it allows for more, and we touched upon this, it allows for more vulnerability and bringing your authentic self into the space. And I think it allows for more job peak performances.
Absolutely, absolutely, because you're not having to worry about job security in that moment. So that becomes one less thing that you're devoting energy and time and effort towards, right? Which then increases the amount of energy and time and effort you can devote to your job. You're not as
Right.
fragmented.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
There's another uh, listener here. Thank you so much. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Utralia Perkins, thank you for joining in. She says making connections and feeling connected are also key. She said, I love this.
Critical. It's critical. And I'm so glad. First of all, thank you to the watcher that raised those talking that particular talking point, because I feel like it took us a while to get to this point where we could begin making space for belongingness and human connection, because there was a time where it was thought that the workforce was viewed almost as robots. You're expected
Mm,
to come in regardless of what went down for you in your world on the weekend, or what happened last night. We were expected to show up and hit the ground running. And it's so refreshing to be in an era, in a time period where you can share depending on that psych safety now, right? But in environments where you feel connected to the environment, you might be able to share a little bit more. And all of this impacts employee satisfaction, job retention, turnover, right? So there are some real organizational benefits to making space for psych safety and belongingness.
absolutely. Absolutely. Toguri, she always tunes in. Thank you, Toki, for being so loyal to the podcast. She says she agrees with everything you're saying, and she says authentic conversations can influence culture, which is what you just said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, authenticity is huge. So I can throw myself under the bus. So I identify as a Black male, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've been in workplace environments where, uh, particularly in instances where I'm the only one that looks like me, or one of only a small few, it's really hard in those moments to bring my full self to the role, because I don't have that sense of psych safety. So there's so much of myself, my authentic self, that I'm sort of shielding, right? So at any given moment, maybe I'm giving 60% to my job, and the other 40% I'm watching my back. I'm being mindful of who I'm talking to and what I'm saying, you know? So if we can remove all that, uh, yeah, at that point, I'm able to be authentic, and I'm able to like roll up my sleeves and jump in and engage with the work, but in a meaningful way. And
Right.
the leader as social architect plays a huge role in setting the tone for everything that we're talking about now.
You're also a professor,
Hmm.
right, at William James College.
Hmm.
And when you think of your students, because a classroom also has to be a safe space.
Yeah.
So when you think of your students, can you give us an example, maybe? And if you need a couple seconds to think about it, we can talk about it now or later. But if can you give us an example of how you bring in safety into your classroom?
Yeah, and I don't even have to think about it. I got an email last week from a
Hmm.
student that needed to submit an assignment late, because a particular scenario had arisen for them. And I took the opportunity in my response to them. So essentially, they reached out asking for an extension. In my response to them, I not only grant that extension, but I share with them a very similar scenario that I found myself in, way back when, and how I would have I would have loved for the professor that I had at that time to have not just granted me the extension, but to have shown some level of understanding for what it was that I was going through in that moment.
Hmm.
And the response that I got from that student was that when they saw my reply, they became emotional,
You're
because
making me emotional.
they knew that like they
Yeah.
could just breathe,
Right.
And actually my message to them: listen, we can table this assignment. You got the extension. Don't worry about that. Take care of yourself,
Right.
right? I'm here to support you. And so it's those types of things, because you're right, within the context of that role, you could argue that, I'm the social architect for the classroom environment, and the messages that I send and or don't send, verbally or non-verbally, are really important. So, not only did I send, is it important to be mindful of the messages that we're sending, but again, it goes back to human connection. There's nothing wrong with, as I did a few days later, just reaching out to that student and saying, hey, I'm hoping everything is good, and just reiterating, I'm here if you need me.
Right.
If not, that's cool. But it's the message I wanted to send.
Absolutely. And as leaders, our cups are, I think it's really important to understand that it's a very giving role,
Yeah.
energetically,
Mhm.
physically, spiritually. That's the way it is. That's the role that imparts all of that. And how do you fill up your cup? At the end of the day, I think every leader who's probably listening to this is
Yeah.
thinking, well, I love my employees, I share and I give, and they have these spaces, and where is the space for you to be able to refill that cup to start
Yeah.
all over again
Yeah.
the next day? I think I'll let you answer the question, and I'll offer a
Yeah.
story.
Well, I'll begin from a place of acknowledging and owning that I'm not the best at um, working in that self care piece. But with that, what I can share is that I am actively making an effort to have a cutoff at the end of each day, right? So the emails are going to keep coming in, right? But I can determine when I stop replying. So what I've chosen to do is sort of, I'll go ahead and say it, do not reach out to, you can reach out to Dr. Rudell, but if it's after 8 o'clock, you're probably not going to hear from me until the next morning. And there's reasons for that, right? Because that's my time. The days are long. The days are long. My days are long. My days are dynamic because I wear more than a few hats. Um, and if I don't, I guess I view it as needing time to recharge because
Mm.
I can't run on empty. I'm just not my best self when I'm exhausted, or when fatigue starts to come in. And it actually does lead to errors or missteps I wouldn't make otherwise. You know what I mean? So I think knowing myself, I've gotten to a place where I'm able to like put the sort of parameters around my day and say, okay, this is the cutoff right here.
I had that conversation with another DEI consultant on LinkedIn, actually, Dr. Nika White. If
Mm,
I'm sure everyone has heard of her. She has these amazing podcasts as well on Fridays, intentional conversations, and we talked about that, and we said how there needs to be. We were going back and forth and understanding how, now that we're hybrid or remote, that having flexible. We talked about having flexible hours so that people could be able to manage all the different and various, moving points, objects in their lives. And one of the things that we did make reference to was having that cutoff time.
yeah,
And I think that's really important. For me, I'm always on, and I find once I've replenished my cup, my ideas start generating over the weekend. And when that happens, I realize that it's because now my brain has rested. I have rested, but there still needs to be a cutoff because you're at home, you're with family, husband, wife, siblings, mom, dad. So aside from setting the boundary for the week, now I believe, for me at least, now I have to start establishing boundaries for myself on the weekend so that I can give my full self to my family. Otherwise, I'll tend to Saturday for me is a day of rest. And Sunday, I'll go back and it feels like a Monday for me. So I have my list, I go down the list and I do what I need to do so that I think, okay, on Monday, this is what I can do on Monday. But then I realize with that comes again, I put myself back on the hamster wheel and now I'm emptying my cup, entering on empty on
Right.
the Monday.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for leaders to, acknowledge that it's okay to have the 2 days off
Absolutely.
and to retract and to replenish and to bring your whole self also to your family. I think that's really important also.
Mhm.
Halloween passed, Thanksgiving is coming up,
Yeah.
Christmas is coming up, the Jewish holidays. There's so many things that are coming up where we have to bring again our full selves to
Yeah.
those places.
Absolutely, absolutely, and particularly for leaders, and for leaders who, either sense a difficult conversation is on the horizon, or maybe in the midst of facilitating, rounds of difficult conversations. There's a measure of stamina involved in that process, and if you are not getting the rest that you need, if you're not taking that time to recharge, it actually could jeopardize the integrity of the architectural sort of structure for the organizational environment. You know, so I guess with that, it sort of underscores the responsibility that leaders have, to themselves as well, not just to the organization, but to themselves as human beings.
Absolutely. I want to thank this LinkedIn user. They've said something, they posted a comment here, and it says, "We know that managed risk taking fosters creativity and innovation. So if employees are not comfortable taking risks, I think this could be a great barrier to innovation and growth."
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I think about taking risks, I think of comfort, right? And one of the things that you and I have spoken a great deal about is just the importance of um, being willing to sort of step outside your comfort zone, because that's where the growth happens, right? It's reaching that point where you're willing to take the risk in the name of personal development or personal growth and development, right? Yeah, and of course we all are at different places on the spectrum of like comfort. Some a little less, some a little more. Um, but it absolutely deserves some space in this conversation, um, because comfort can be a double-edged sword, right? When we go back to someone's willingness to do something that they are uncomfortable with, there's a lot there.
Mm,
There's a lot there. So, with that said, comfort and or discomfort, those are really powerful emotions that can affect our ability to function within the systems that we're talking about right now.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, how can avoidance of entering into challenging conversations impact organizational culture?
I would say, simply a manageable situation, or theoretically a situation that's likely manageable, can go from manageable to unmanageable very quickly
Mm,
if left unattended.
mm,
And so there are benefits to rolling up one's sleeves, particularly for leaders, and sort of cutting that off before it escalates to that point. Now, when we think of organizations, and we think of sort of organizational culture and like the different sort of areas of operation, I've seen, by way of org assessment, I've seen where challenging scenarios could have been cut off and instead spread almost like wildfires. And so now, instead of having this one department, you have now half your company that's now dealing with this issue, when it could have been potentially dealt with had someone somewhere been willing to engage in the conversation that they probably knew needed to happen, but they were unwilling to engage.
Right. What's your take on assessments? When I say non-assessments, surveys or employee feedbacks, if it's anonymous and employees, because I'm hearing what you're saying about being uncomfortable and comfortable,
Mhm. Yeah,
and a lot comes into play in the human psyche when you're uncomfortable.
absolutely.
And if not feeling comfortable having a dialogue, would you suggest, and you mentioned earlier, taking their pulse, would, doing an employee feedback
Mm-hmm.
or a survey anonymously also help bring, those difficult conversations to light?
Absolutely. And I think what comes to mind for me is the power of narrative. You want to know how your workforce, you should want to know how folks are perceiving their day to day, how are they perceiving their role, and by extension, how are they making meaning of the organization's culture? And so there's several mechanisms for capturing that. So there are surveys, and even within surveys, there's different styles. So there are stakeholder surveys where organizations will distribute surveys to just leaders, from frontline all the way up to the executive leadership team. So we have like stakeholder surveys. There are traditional employee surveys designed to capture the narrative of the collective workforce aside from those that are in positions of leadership. There are ERGs, there are focus groups, there's qualitative interviews, there's a number of different ways. And I can tell you that from being on the other end in terms of someone who's facilitated org assessments, I can't tell you how much rich data comes from the narratives that are collected. I remember sitting with the CEO, this is probably about 5-6 months ago, and I'm sharing with him. I had the dubious distinction of of having responsibility of having to share with him the findings that were really difficult for me to share, difficult for him to hear.
Mm,
But in turn, it led to a conversation that absolutely needed to happen. And to his credit, he was willing to not just hear it, um, but to actually reconsider the systems in his organization that were sort of perpetuating some of this, some of the not so great data points that came from the org assessment.
that's pretty powerful. So you think in essence, this, so it wasn't tabled. I mean, you said you were given, that the task
Okay.
to to have this conversation. How did that make you feel? Because that's really key, because it's a CEO.
Yeah,
Like,
that was hard. That was hard. Yeah, because it pretty much, I, I pretty much had to share with him that for his female employees and for his employees of color, um, they simply didn't feel that sense of belonging
hmm,
that's so critical to helping folks perform their role optimally.
hmm,
Um, it was a clear absence of psychological safety. And so I will say this, um, as an org psychologist and OD practitioner, um, sharing feedback is really only step one, because next up is now recommendations. Okay, so now we've assessed the data that's come out of the assessment. Where do we go from here? And so for my part, it's always trying to frame the report out as an opportunity. So in sitting with him, it was sort of like, hey, I see some opportunities here, um, for your organization to sort of reconsider, how you're engaging with your Black employees, right? So at no point did I say to him, listen, some folks are thinking of leaving, some folks are thinking, like, I didn't, all of that stuff, actually, he already knew that. Um, but in his and I's conversation, I try to be as strength based as possible and as real as possible and as authentic as possible, understanding that, you know, I want to make sure that the narratives are heard in a productive way. Last thing I wanted was for him to become defensive. And because I've seen that happen too, and no good comes from that. So again, to his credit, he heard it for what it was and made, in my view, the right adjustments. Yeah.
And that brings us to listening.
Mm-hmm.
So how important is listening?
Yeah.
Or if we say active listening, because there's a
Yeah.
big difference between active listening and just listening,
Mm-hmm.
to being able to hold those effective dialogues. How important do you think that is?
It's critical.
Mm.
It's imperative. And I'll take it a step further. You can't have one without the other. So if we're going to talk difficult conversations, it comes down to two things. There's two parts to that equation. There's the dialogue itself, but as one person is talking, the degree to which the other person is engaged via listening, that's a whole other component, right? So there's active, and I would add reflective listening. So active listening, demonstrating that you're engaged in a conversation, you're nodding, you're making eye contact, you are, through your mannerisms, or through your affect, you are, showing that you're connected to the nature of the, conversation that's being shared with you. So that would be active. Reflective is also very important too. Repeating back to the person what they just said, because it's going to do two things. First, it lets them know that you're listening. But secondly, it actually can create pathways for, clarity. So if you say something to me and I repeat it back to you, and what I repeat back to you isn't accurate, then it creates a space for you to then step in and say, actually, that's not what I said. Or actually, that's part of what I said, um, but you missed this part over here, right? So if we're going to engage in dialogue, particularly challenging and or difficult dialogue, um, active and reflective listening are critical components of that.
So when you say active,
Mm-hmm.
what does that look like? Does that mean that, and I've been in situations and I'm guilty of this as well. Does active listening mean that I'm going to hold all my questions that are coming to surface for the end of the sentence? Or am I actively listening and processing and reflecting, like you said, the information and not sharing?
So I'm gonna say, because I guess where, in everything that you just said, the one area that I would caution, um, anyone who's sort of on the listening end, the not sharing. I guess I'd want to just make sure that you're not sharing. Maybe you're not sharing because you feel like it's just not appropriate at that time, which is okay, versus not sharing because you don't feel safe enough to share, right? Um, but generally speaking, and I should say sort of like broadly speaking, active listening, um, is an opportunity to convey that you're listening to the conversation and you're hearing the conversation on a deeper level. So whatever has to be done to convey that, and again, it could be nodding, it could be your mannerisms, it could be anything along those lines. Um, Anything that demonstrates that the other person is being heard.
Right. That's interesting. And what do you want the audience to to take away from this conversation?
So what, you know, this was an ambitious talk that we attempted to have today, right, around difficult conversations. The takeaway here, I boil it down to two things: dialogue and listening. Okay, are um, two tools that, when used together, can help create pathways for shared understanding. Both of them are extremely important. I would caution um, folks from shying away from entering into difficult conversations. Um, yeah. And so, you know, you and I have spoken about this. I mean, my hope is that we can continue this dialogue, and you know, but by way of some of the talks that we have coming up, where I would love to actually get into specific strategies around how to hold difficult conversations. So I mentioned at the top of the call, and for those that maybe have joined since, spent about 15 years in the space of studying the human condition and strategies around difficult conversations through my work as a psychotherapist for individuals, couples, teams, and families. I would love to actually share some of those strategies in our next few talks. Let's say, you know, in our next talk or two, I'd love to actually provide some strategies, some concrete approaches and techniques that people can use in their workday.
Oh, that's something to look forward to.
I hope so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, this has been wonderful. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I would like to thank all of you for listening. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We share profound and courageous dialogue that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag diversity connects us.